Yo, what's going on, boys? Welcome back to the Juicecast. A very eventful couple of days for the Juicecast. In my last video, I said I wasn't going to make another video about UFC 328. I guess technically this is not a video, but it kind of is related to UFC 328. In this video of the Juicecast, essentially what I wanted to talk about is the beef between Ariel Helwani and Sean Strickland, as this definitely has been the talk of the town. There's been a lot of fans in support of Sean Strickland and a lot of fans against Ariel Helwani in this sort of beef, and I kind of wanted to give my take on this whole situation. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So any of you guys that are not informed about what's actually going on between Ariel Helwani and Sean Strickland, I'll quickly update you guys on the situation. So essentially, Ariel Helwani today came on his show and completely ripped into Sean Strickland. And he said a lot of things in this little 6-minute clip. I'm not going to play the entire clip or really much of it at all. But essentially what Ariel Helwani said in this episode was, he thought Sean Strickland was a phony. He thought that the things that Sean Strickland said about Khamzat Chimaev before the fight, criticizing him as a person, criticizing his culture, criticizing his mom, his religion, all of those things were horrible things to say. And if he was going to say those things before the fight, he should keep that same energy after the fight. Obviously, he said a little bit more than that, but that's essentially the criticism that Ariel Helwani gave to Strickland. And he essentially said that Sean Strickland is a phony. And in response to all of that, Sean Strickland ended up responding in this statement here. And essentially what Sean Strickland was saying is, Ariel Helwani is a leech and, he sucks, whatever. And essentially, a lot of the things that Sean Strickland said before the fight actually happened, after the fight actually happened, he changed his mind. He thought a lot of those things he said went a bit too far. And essentially he said, when you spend 25 minutes in the octagon with an opponent, you gain a certain level of respect for him. And that's kind of what you were seeing after the fact. And obviously that's true. We have seen that a lot, actually, with a lot of fighters that have beef. After the fight's over, they usually do make up. There's certain occasions where that doesn't happen, obviously, but for the most part, honestly, it does. But something that some of you may be wondering is, what are my thoughts on this whole situation? Do I side more with Ariel Helwani or do I side more with Sean Strickland? Well, in my opinion, I kind of am in between both these guys. My opinion on the whole situation of UFC 328 is as follows. Essentially, going into this fight, from the press conference, from the ceremonial weigh-ins, I was very excited for this fight, in part due to the beef between both these fighters. This didn't feel like a traditional beef. Traditionally, when you talk about fighters that have beef, like, for example, Colby Covington and Kamaru Usman or something of that sort, a lot of times you can tell these guys are just kind of trying to build it up to sell the fight. And I think that's a great example, actually, what I just mentioned, Colby versus Kamaru Usman. As going into both of their fights, they were both trash-talking each other before the fact, but then after the second fight, they kind of made up. And it was always pretty obvious, I thought, that it was just to sell the fight. It was kind of for fun, and Colby Covington, obviously, after the fact, said such. But there have been a couple of examples of fights where going into them, after the fight happens, regardless of the result, these guys are not going to be buddy-buddy regardless of what happens. Like, for example, in fights that, would make sense in those scenarios would be fights like Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. Those guys are never going to be friends, regardless of what happened in that fight. They're never going to be friends in 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30, 40 years from now. Another example is John Jones versus DC. Those guys are never going to be friends, regardless of what happened in their fights. Another example is Colby Covington versus Jorge Masvidal. Those guys are never going to be friends, regardless of what happens in that fight or regardless of what happens going forward. And I think, to me personally, Sean Strickland and Khamzat Chimaev felt very similar to those. Based upon the things that both Strickland and Khamzat were saying about each other, it didn't feel like these guys were trying to sell the fight. It felt like they legitimately hated each other. So going into the fight, at least for me personally, I think a lot of people are going to disagree with this part of the take, but going into the fight, when both Sean Strickland and Khamzat Chimaev ended up glove touching before the fact and kind of became buddy-buddy before every single round, it did kind of feel as if the beef was fake. Now, I know Strickland will deny that. He said he kind of just had a change in heart, and essentially he regretted a lot of the things that he said about Khamzat, but to me personally, it felt like we were being boozled a little bit. And I think the real difference between, let's say, Sean Strickland in this fight versus Khamzat or Colby Covington in his fight versus Kamaru Usman was the things that Colby Covington was saying were clearly trying to build up the fight, and he was clearly just trying to sell the fight. Or even a Josh Hokett, he's obviously playing a character as well. But as for Sean Strickland, it does feel genuine. But in reality, I guess it's not. It's not genuine. He's also playing a character, but he's doing a much better job at it as compared to a Colby Covington or a Josh Hokett. It feels like it's real. But in my opinion, I feel like it's not. I think he does a lot of things for attention. But I guess really my thoughts on it, to simplify it a little bit. I know I'm kind of rambling, but to simplify it a little bit, I just felt as if a big reason for why I personally got very excited for Hamzat versus Strickland was in part due to the beef. And this kind of felt like the biggest beef that we've had in a long time. And the fact that that one big aspect of why I was excited for the fight got taken away before the fight even started kind of rubs me the wrong way, I guess I'll say. And after the fact, when they were kind of apologizing to each other, Strickland apologized to Hamzat, and Hamzat ended up putting the belt around Strickland. I thought that was a great moment. And even the post-fight speech where Strickland was saying, like, he apologized to, everybody that he offended or whatever. I thought that was all really nice. After the fact, it was all really nice. But before the fight started, the fact that they were glove touching at the beginning of every round and kind of buddy buddy did kind of rub me the wrong way, and did kind of feel like we were being boozled a little bit. So that's kind of my thoughts on the whole situation. But I guess I don't really agree with either guy. I don't really agree with Ariel Helwani, because Ariel Helwani was kind of saying some of the things that I was saying, but at the same time, he was saying that it would have been better if Sean Strickland just continued with the character after the fact. I don't necessarily agree with that. And I don't necessarily agree with Sean Strickland either, because Sean Strickland essentially was saying that, after fighting this guy for 25 minutes, he gained a new respect for Hamzat Chimaev, and that is something that happens all the time. But they were kind of buddy buddy before the fight even started. So I guess I'm kind of in the middle between both these fighters, and that's kind of where my stance is on this whole situation. Now, I think a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this take. I have seen a lot of chatter online on Twitter about, people going at Ariel Helwani. And in part, I do agree. I'm definitely not a big Ariel Helwani fan at all. I think a lot of times he does miss the mark. I think a lot of times he does like to stir the pot. It is very frustrating when he has certain fighters on his podcast or on his show, and he's clearly trying to get them to say something bad about their opponents, and then he can have their opponents on, and his opponents can say something bad about their opponents, and it kind of just continues on. I get why people call Ariel Helwani a weasel, and honestly, I kind of agree. He is kind of trying to play the game to get guys hating each other, to get more views on his podcast and make more money and all that. I do agree with that sort of stance that a lot of fans have. And listen, I'm not a big Ariel Helwani fan, but I guess in this specific situation, I'm kind of in the middle of both these fighters. But with that being said, that doesn't take anything away from the great performance that Sean Strickland had. I thought he looked great in this fight. He surprised me a lot with his ability to stuff takedowns as early as he was able to do. Also, his ability to, strike effectively off the back foot was impressive as well. And I thought he just did a great job. And I thought he clearly won the fight. Rounds 2, 3, 5, I thought were pretty clear in favor of Sean Strickland. I was happy to see him get the decision. And as I said before, I was happy to see that Hamzat Chimaev ended up wrapping the belt around Strickland. I thought that was a really nice moment. And also the post-fight speech for Sean Strickland, I thought that was a nice moment. So seeing those sort of things after the fact is really cool. And in my opinion, that's a big reason for why a lot of us have became MMA fans. You can have, the most dislike for your opponent before the fight, but after the fight, not always. Obviously, I mentioned a couple scenarios where that's not the case, but usually after the fight, you make up with your opponent regardless of who wins or who loses. And that's why the sport is so beautiful, in my opinion. So great performance from Strickland. Going forward, I would like to see who he fights next. I do think it's probably going to be Imavov, but that's essentially my thoughts on the beef between Ariel Helwani as well as Sean Strickland. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. You guys agree with my take? Do you agree more so with Sean Strickland's take? Do you agree more so with Ariel Helwani's take? Do you fall in the middle? Where do you guys stand in terms of this beef between these two guys? But until the next time, boys, I'll see you in the next one. Peace out, fellas.